The reality is you're a scumbag hypocrite that was okay with the shooting of Ashley Babbitt. And so you're clutching at anything because no
You're
two
the hypocrite,
situations,
dude.
let me
I'm not
finish,
the fucking hypocrite.
no two situations are completely apples to apples ever. So you're finding some irrelevant detail to say, this is why I justify the shooting of Ashley Babbitt, but not Renee Good.
I wanted to ask you about the Ashley Babbitt comparison you were making with
Yeah.
the Renee Good situation and the Alex situation. You
Okay.
understand that there's a huge difference in going at somebody pointing a gun at you, being inside a federal building when a federal election is being certified, and these supporters rapidly coming after you. You understand there's a huge difference between what happened there and what happened with Alex, for example, who was just trying to get in between a fight. He was pretty much just trying to stop a fight. It didn't seem like the ICE agent was arresting either of the two women, and Alex just got in between and tried to stop the fight. If they were trying to arrest any of the women, they would have pulled out handcuffs. They would have pulled out, some kind of weapon, either pepper spray or um, some kind of taser or something. And
Okay.
and really quick, I know pepper spray was brought out eventually. And I want to ask you, do you think somebody who has pepper spray in their eyes and has 6 or 7 ICE agents around them, do you think that person thinks that they're going to be able to defend themselves using a weapon, using their concealed weapon?
Okay, two questions. First, let's start with the first. Absolutely right. There are significant differences with what happened with Renee Good and this gentleman today versus Ashley Babbitt. Both Renee Good and this gentleman had lethal weapons as they assaulted police officers. That did not happen with Ashley Babbitt. We have no evidence of her assaulting an officer, nor do we have evidence of her having a lethal weapon. And so in both situations, we see that what happened with these two people was more justified on just those metrics alone. The fact that an officer, quote, had a gun pointed that makes it different is absurd, right? The idea that you're having a violent altercation with a police officer, but they didn't currently have the gun drawn on you, therefore it's somehow unexpected, is nonsensical. I welcome you to try that experiment or ask anyone with the legal defense, and they would say that that is absolutely fucking moronic. This is just something that lefties try to say to justify their hatred of Ashley Babbitt and what happened to her. Oh, if he wouldn't have had a gun drawn and just said, I'm going to shoot you, you would have said, oh, then it was an illogical shoot. He can't do it. But the fact he had the gun pointed, then it's okay. Similarly, if they would have had the gun pointed right here at Renee Good, if they had the gun pointed longer, then you would have said, oh, it's a lawful shoot. So I'll ask you before I get to your second question, how long does a gun need to
I
be
would say that.
pointed?
Yeah,
Let me
I
finish.
would say.
How long does a gun have to be pointed from law enforcement giving you lawful orders before you say, well, the shooting was justified?
Rob, it doesn't have to be law enforcement. Let's say you're at Walmart and some
No, but it
hobo
is law enforcement. That's what no, but it is law
there's law
enforcement.
enforcement at Walmart and some hobo is coming at the law enforcement and he has the gun pointed at the hobo.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, obviously that would be more like you don't know if that person is under some kind of substance. You don't know if that person has a concealed weapon like Alex did. Ashley Babbitt could have easily had a concealed weapon like Alex did. But
what's the relevance to what we're talking about right here, which is whether or not the law enforcement officer has the gun pointed or not? You said that yes, if the gun had been pointed in the situation of Renee Good or assumably here, then it would make sense at that point for the shoot. It would be a legitimate shoot. Explain.
If for example, there was an arrest going on with Alex or Renee Good, and they pulled out their gun because they thought that she had some kind of weapon in her car or something.
Forget that because they thought that's irrelevant.
The gun pointed. Perfectly. Let's pretend that they did have more of a reason to think that Alex could be dangerous or Renee.
It's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. They had the gun pointed
at them. No, I would say you either flee, but if that person still attacks, then yes.
So just to be clear, let's be clear. Let's be clear. You changed the analogy to said if there's reason to suspect they have a weapon. Did Bird have reason to suspect that Ashley Babbitt was armed?
Rob, were people getting checked on their way into the Capitol? I'm asking you a question.
I asked you a question.
How could Bird know that she didn't until after the fact, until days after that nobody was armed? How would Bird know that?
So it seems that your answer is no, he didn't know, but he had reason to not know, correct?
He had reason to suspect that she might, if she's coming at.
Okay, why didn't they have reason to suspect Renee Good had a weapon? Why didn't they have reason to suspect that Renee Good had a weapon?
If they did, they would have had their weapons pointed at her way beforehand.
You don't know that? That's not true.
What do you mean? Yes, of course that's true.
It's not true. I interact with police officers all the time when I'm open carrying and they don't point their guns at me.
Right. If they deem her a legitimate threat, then of course they would pull out their weapons beforehand.
They did. They did. Once she started to advance forward, they viewed her as a legitimate threat.
So bad faith that you're going to say in the milliseconds that Ross pulled his weapon out, that Renee should have automatically complied and known. And that
that's not completely different. If you'd listen,
going after Bird.
If you would listen, speaking of bad faith, if you'd listen, you would hear what I'm saying. So give me a chance to explain this. Anyone in their right mind knows that law enforcement officers are armed. So the idea that you could attack, advance upon, etc., law enforcement officer if they don't have their gun pulled at you, and that's totally understandable. But if they do pull the gun, then it's like, oh shit, you're not allowed to do that, is laughable. The fact that if Michael Bird didn't have his gun pointed and that all of a sudden he would have unholstered and shot would have made it more or less legal is absurd. There is no legal theory whatsoever that says that. Ashley Babbitt would have suspected Michael Bird, but let me finish. Ashley Babbitt would have assumed Michael Bird was armed, just like Renee Good would have assumed the officers stopping her were armed, just like this gentleman today would have assumed the officers with him were armed. Attacking an armed officer and saying, oh, I wouldn't have attacked if he had his gun drawn, so therefore you're not allowed to defend yourself with the gun if I'm attacking you before the gun is drawn, is one of the dumbest claims I've ever heard.
Rob, do you defend Kyle Rittenhouse?
Yes.
You do. Because he had a weapon and people were going at him while he had a weapon. So it's reasonable to think that those people may have a concealed weapon, some kind of knife.
Wait. Okay, let's pause.
The weapon away from Kyle Rittenhouse or anybody who's pointing a gun at another person.
Here we go.
It's easy to assume that person is going to try and take the weapon out of their hands and use it against them.
Here you go, just rambling on. Right. So it's reasonable to assume, if it's reasonable to assume someone has a weapon and you come at them, you ought to expect to get shot? That's your argument?
If somebody has their weapon pointed at you and they're warning you to back off,
that's not what you said.
Yes, that is my argument.
You said if it's,
good job, you got it.
You said if it's reasonable to assume that they have a weapon and you go at them, you should expect to be shot. That was your claim, correct?
This is what I'm going to
pause and we're going to get an answer to this question. You just said, if it's reasonable, do you see what you know just happened is you just contradicted yourself. You said, and I quote, if it's reasonable to assume that they have a weapon and you come at them, you can expect to be shot, correct? Just say yes or no.
No, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying.
Then what were you talking about? Reasonable to assume they had a weapon. Explain what you meant by that.
If they are not in fear for their life and because somebody has a weapon pointed at them and they're still going at the person who has the weapon in their hands, then it's safe to assume that that person is going to take the weapon away and use it against that person, or that they may have a knife, or that they may have some kind of weapon that works at a closer range, some pepper spray that they can use first and then take the weapon away. There's so many possibilities.
Is it reasonable to assume law enforcement officers have weapons?
Of course.
So then your example when you were talking about Rittenhouse contradicts what you're trying to say. Yes, of course, Renee Good and this gentleman today, it would have been reasonable for them to both assume before getting in altercations with police that their opponents were armed, correct?
You're not saying it. Yeah, obviously.
Right.
Yeah.
And so again, there is no differentiation as to whether the officer had the gun pulled pointing at her as she advanced the car forward, or she advanced the car forward into a law enforcement officer that was armed, and then he drew the gun and fired. Both situations identical.
There's a huge difference in those situations.
There's
yes,
not.
The weapon being out of the holster. What are you talking about? Ask anybody. who's ever owned a gun, or
Go
you
fight a
don't
cop.
take,
Go
you don't
punch a
take
cop
out the
right now.
gun.
Go.
You don't
You
take
can.
out the weapon unless you're planning on using it. You know this. I don't know why you're trying to make this stupid point.
Right? Okay. You don't
So
take out the
our
weapon
weapon
unless you.
being
So does
pointed
that
is
mean?
a big difference than it being in the holster.
So just to be clear, your argument is you don't take out a weapon unless you plan on using it. Therefore, if you're punching and beating the shit out of or using lethal force against a law enforcement officer and they haven't brought their gun out, you should not be expecting for them to bring the gun out and use it. That's your argument.
You're getting distracted. That's
I'm not
not the
getting
point.
distracted. That's the
I'm
exact
not
scenario.
justifying attacking federal agents. Well, you're trying to change this conversation into
I'm
something
not trying to
stupid.
change the conversation. You're trying to make the conversation stupid. So, from the perspective of a law enforcement officer, if you have the exact same situation with Renee Good, if he had the gun pointed and the exact same thing happens, is it a lawful shoot?
If the agents came up to her with their weapons drawn, and she still now, I still think there's a difference between going at someone and fleeing, but I would give it more of a reason to apprehend Renee Good or whoever is fleeing, because at that point I'm
We're not
assuming that
talking about
they think that
apprehension.
person
We're
is
talking
more
about the
dangerous
shooting. We're not talking about apprehension. We're
because they
talking
may have
about
a
the
weapon
shooting.
or because they may be intoxicated or something.
We're not
But
talking about
okay, with
apprehension.
Renee
We're
Good, that was
asking
not the
whether or
case.
not we're trying to make this as apples to apples as clear as possible. On scenario 1, we have the scenario as it played out. On scenario 2, the exact same scenario except the officer's gun's drawn. Is the shoot good in the second scenario but not in the first?
Describe those situations again. I think it's very simple what I'm pointing out. If the weapon is drawn and you still try to attack that person who has the
If you
weapon,
attack a
then
cop,
it's
you're a fucking
completely
idiot. You
justified.
know they're
If
armed.
that person flees, depending on the state, you know how those laws work. You know
This is
that it
unbelievable. It
depends
is
on the state.
unbelievable. Yes, I know how the laws work. If you attack a police officer thinking maybe they won't deploy their gun, you're a fucking idiot.
You still think Renee was attacking that officer? You still think that she was?
I think the question of whether or not the officer's gun was drawn at the time she advanced his vehicle towards him is irrelevant to whether or not it was a lawful shoot. Your argument is that it is of key relevance.
It's completely significant.
It is not. Show me the law.
Time,
Show me the law.
The amount of time
Show me the law.
That Ashley Babbitt had to recognize that a weapon was drawn compared to Renee Good.
You're making the claim. Show me the law.
I don't know how I have to spell this out for you, Rob. I sincerely don't know how this has to be spelled out for you.
Show me the law. Where does it say
I'll
the
find it for
officer's
you.
justified in shooting if his gun's already drawn? Show me. Show me one time where that's occurred. Go ahead.
I'll find it to you and I'll send it to you. But like I said, it depends on the
because
state.
You're lying because it doesn't exist.
Law, in court, obviously these things are taken into account.
They're
obviously,
not taken. Show me one trial it's ever taken into account in this sense.
The draw time or it's about the reasonable threat to bodily harm or being unalive.
That is absolutely correct. You are absolutely right. That's what it's about. So, in the case of the Renee Good shooting, what it would be about was if the officer reasonably felt that his life was in danger, it would be irrelevant to say, oh, his gun was drawn, so that impacts his reasonable fear. That's irrelevant. That's all that matters in that case. Saying, oh, if he had his gun drawn and was like this, and then she advanced towards him, now it's a reasonable shoot. But if he didn't, and instead she started coming at him and he drew it and fired, now it's an unreasonable shoot. Is ridiculous. It is a ridiculous point, especially because what it seems to be implying, correct me if I'm wrong, your argument's something like this. Well, if the gun was drawn, now it's serious business. Now the people know, oh, I can't fuck around, the gun's drawn. But if the gun's not drawn, then they're not looking at it like that. Is that you're correct? Is that the interpretation you have?
Can you repeat that last question, Rob?
Yes, your argument seems to be if the gun's drawn, now it's like, uh-oh, the person that the gun's drawn against, like, uh-oh, this is serious business. I better mind my P's and Q's. But if the gun's not drawn, then they're not thinking of it that way.
Yeah, I think there's a huge difference between drawing your weapon and having the intention to use it.
No, see, so you said yes. And what I'm telling you is that is irrelevant when it comes to perceived or actual attacks against law enforcement. Particularly because everybody knows that law enforcement's armed, right? So if you're willing to jeopardize a law enforcement's life through a vehicle or through a violent interaction and what's perceived in this case as a possible firearm being deployed while resisting arrest, it's irrelevant as to whether or not the cops already had their guns deployed. Again, now let's take this situation. If, as this gentleman's being wrestled to the ground today, 3 guns had their guns pointed at him and the exact same situation plays out, is it now a justified shoot in your mind?
If Alex had, if he was interfering in an arrest, then
He
yeah.
was. He already
No,
was.
he wasn't. He
That's
wasn't.
bullshit.
You don't know that.
Define arrest.
You don't know that. You don't know
Okay,
that those
so
2 women were being arrested.
just to be clear, if I see police macing a woman and then coming at her and I interfere with that, that's not a crime. That's not interfering with an arrest. But if I see them do the same thing and then reach for handcuffs, now I can't do it? That's your argument?
Look, there's still details that we don't know, and I don't think either of us can claim to know whether an arrest or was actually happening.
It's irrelevant in this sense. In this sense, it's irrelevant. I would be interested to see the case law that differentiates between whether or not it's lawful for you to intervene in an application of force to a person based on if you thought they were going to arrest that person or not.
An application of force to a person versus whether that person was going to be arrested or not?
Correct. In this context, what I'm talking about specifically is if you say, well, just because they saw them pepper spray that woman and then go towards her, he wasn't sure that they were going to arrest her, would be irrelevant in this equation. By putting his hands on police officer and preventing them from going towards the woman, it's the same as to whether or not that cop was going to say either A, I was just going to administer aid to her face, or B, I was going to handcuff her. It is irrelevant in that context. You cannot interfere with police trying to go after a suspect or going after someone in a confrontation this way. It doesn't matter if you say, I assume the officer wasn't going to arrest her. That's irrelevant to the equation. Just like whether or not he had his gun drawn is irrelevant as to whether or not it was a justified shooting. Again, what I don't understand, I could make the case for you guys, and I haven't made up my mind yet. I can make the case for the left 50 times better than all you fucking morons that calling in are. Right? It would be this. Listen, the guy was on his hands and knees, and it's clear that the gun seemed to be out of his reach at the time that the shots came in.
Exactly.
That's where the question is, did they have their guns drawn before they shot? Did they have the guns drawn before they shot Renee Good? That's irrelevant stupidity.
I brought that up just to compare the Renee situation with the Ashley Babbitt situation. With the Alex situation is slightly different. And yeah, the gun being drawn is obviously not a factor with Alex. With Renee and Ashley was obviously variable that was confident in both.
It's irrelevant.
No, what I'm saying is that
I just want to be clear. If Michael Bird had his gun drawn, let's do this just to make this as clear as possible. Then, if Michael Bird hadn't had his gun drawn, then the shooting would have been unjustified. If she just advanced towards him and he drew right there and shot, that's an unjustified shoot in your mind. He's yelling, "Stop! Stop! Don't come any further!" But his gun's not drawn. Then it's a bad shoot.
This distinction is silly. It's just you trying to divert the conversation into something that...
You literally just said it's only about 2 things. Renee Good versus Ashley Babbitt. Great.
If that didn't happen... Okay, here, I'll engage. Sure. If Bird didn't have his weapon drawn and he was just warning her to not get closer, and then she did, and he didn't know what she was going to do, I mean... I think the drawing of the weapon is a big factor. Yes, the reality is it happened, and in the way it happened, it's completely justified. Now, I don't know.
You have no clue. The reality is you're equivocating. The reality is. I'll explain the reality. I'll explain the reality to you. The reality is you're a scumbag hypocrite that was okay with the shooting of Ashley Babbitt, and so you're clutching at anything because no two situations. Let me finish. No two situations are completely apples to apples ever. So you're finding some irrelevant detail to say, this is why I justify the shooting of Ashley Babbitt, but not Renee Good. When in almost all circumstances, the shooting of Renee Good would be far more justified, even if you think that the shooting of Ashley Babbitt was justified. Ashley Babbitt posed no visible threat to life to Michael Bird. None. At all. That's not the case with Renee Good. The officer had a reasonable fear for his life and, in fact, had been clipped by the vehicle, which would be a deadly weapon. And your argument's like, yeah, but Michael Byrd had his gun drawn, so therefore that's different, is nonsensical. In both the case of Renee Good and Ashley Babbitt, they both would have been imminently aware that the officer in front of them was armed. Do you disagree with that? Do you think there was any doubt in both situations that they knew the officer in front of them was armed?
Look, yeah, obviously law enforcement are armed, okay?
Right.
But whenever they draw a weapon, they assume the situation is threatening to themselves or the public around them. That's the big difference. Whenever a weapon is drawn, they deem that person an actual threat, beyond, any suspicion.
Okay.
At that point, there's a big difference in having your gun drawn versus not. Do you understand that?
No, I do not.
You don't
It's
think,
it's different. It's different. It's like saying it is. Okay, I'll explain to you. I'll explain to you. I'll explain to you. There is a difference in this sense. Isn't there a big difference when an officer wears a black uniform as opposed to a blue uniform? Is that a difference? Just answer yes or no. Is that a difference?
It is a difference, but it's not like having your weapon drawn versus not.
I think that Michael Byrd was wearing a blue uniform, right? And so therefore, it's that shooting's not justified. But I think it was like a fatigue type uniform. Yep, those are different. It's different. So Renee Good shooting was justified. It's different. You admitted it's different. You did admit it's different. You have to admit you admitted it was different, right?
You know you're being silly right now, right?
Yes, just like you're being silly.
I'm not being silly.
You are correct.
Drawing a weapon is not the same as wearing a different colored uniform. This is ridiculous.
You are correct in this sense. From an outside perspective, if you're looking and you see a situation where you have no idea what's going on and you just see a picture, and in one picture you see an officer with the gun drawn and the other you don't, you could say, I could intuit that in that first picture, the officer is perceiving some sort of threat. But we know that both officers perceive some sort of threat regardless of the status of their gun drawn. That makes the difference irrelevant. You don't get to say, let me ask this. If instead of a car, Renee Good pulled a gun and shot at that guy, at the officer that shot her, would he then be allowed to shoot only if his gun was pre-drawn? When's he allowed to shoot at that point?
I'm not saying that there's not just two options here. I'm not saying that an officer who doesn't have their weapon drawn can't foresee a danger.
You're taking a variable that is irrelevant in a moral and legal sense. You are taking a variable that's irrelevant in a moral and legal sense. In both senses, this variable is irrelevant. The officer, if the officer feared for his life, let's just take Renee Good. Either it is justified because he was clipped by what he saw was a deadly weapon and feared for his life, or he was not justified. In both cases, the status of his gun being drawn before that occurred is completely irrelevant to both a moral and legal analysis of that. The same is true of the Ashley Babbitt shooting. Either it's justified or it's not. Show me the law. Show me the law then.
You want me to show you the law?
Yes, show me the law that says that this would have been a justified shooting if his gun had been pre-drawn.
Rob, you own weapons, right? You own guns, right?
I do.
So you understand that taking your gun out of the holster is because you plan on using it. That's
irrelevant. That is not always the case. There's all sorts of reasons I could take my gun out of the holster and don't plan on discharging.
With a law enforcement officer pointing a weapon at you, you've done something seriously bad. But if you don't, then there's degrees to this. There's not just
that is true. That is true, but it's irrelevant in the case of both of these things. The reason in both cases it's irrelevant is because both of them were either doing things that justified a credible threat to the officer or other public safety, or they didn't. Whether or not the officer had his gun drawn beforehand is irrelevant to that calculus. For example, is an officer allowed to shoot you for any reason as long as he has his gun drawn and is yelling? You would say, no, that's absurd. For example, if you're like, hey, I'm wearing a Dallas Cowboy jersey, and the cop says, take that fucking shirt off right now, and points a gun at you for 10 seconds, and you're like, what the fuck are you doing? And then blasts you away, you don't get to say, justified shooting. He pulled his gun. You knew he meant business. No, it would only be justified if it's justified in the calculation of a continuum of force, and he felt that his life was in danger or that the life of people in public were in danger. Whether or not he had his firearm drawn is irrelevant. You might say, well, if you're Ashley Babbitt, you should have known Michael Byrd was more pissed, but it's irrelevant. You should have probably known that breaking into a secured area took risk of violence anyways. Whether or not the gun was pointed would be irrelevant in that calculus. And it's certainly irrelevant to the calculus of the only thing that matters is that this was justified, which is the thought process of the officer. There is no law that I'm aware of that suggests that the type of shooting and his fear is reasonably increased based on these sorts of things. Secondly, it would absolutely be true with the Renee Good case, even if there was a case with Michael Byrd, because the calculation is fear of being attacked with a deadly weapon. Again, if you take the car out of the equation and use a firearm, if she quickly draws a firearm, how long does the officer have to wait before he draws his firearm and discharges it? 5 seconds? He has to point his gun at her 5 seconds as she's drawing and pointing at him? Or do you say, no, as soon as he sees the threat of a lethal weapon being directed at him, he gets to fire, even if he didn't have his gun pre-drawn? Which is it?
I understand the differences there, but
I asked you a question. I asked you a question. Just answer.
The gun being drawn is an obvious salient factor here, okay?
Why? Why would it? Explain to me the thought process why that would be.
Because at that point, the officer deems the threat at, top level or whatever, red, code level red or whatever the fuck is military or police protocol.
You tell me if you agree with this. Would you agree with this? It's because the officer now has a reasonable fear for his life because there's a deadly weapon being utilized against him?
Look, let's talk about the numbers.
Just say yes or no. Just say yes or no.
I'll give you that. Okay. Sure.
Now, last question. Then I'll leave you ask some questions. Can a vehicle be a deadly weapon?
Yes, but I don't think anybody. Yeah, okay, fine. A vehicle can be a deadly weapon. Now, Ross using his weapon, was that going to make him safe from the vehicle being aimed at him, or if it was aimed at him, which I don't think it was, but was that going to stop in a reasonable way the danger that was in front of him?
2 points on this. Yes, clearly the vehicle not only was aimed at him, it literally hit him, showing that it was aimed. Secondly, 2 parts to this. One, yes, if someone's trying to run you down with a vehicle, shooting at them can cause a reaction to them to swerve or to take their foot off the gas, etc., which can save your life. Secondly, it's irrelevant in the eyes of the law anyways, because once an officer has a reasonable fear for his life or people in the lives of the community, he is allowed to neutralize the threat. And someone who is willing to run over and commit vehicular manslaughter or murder, a vehicular homicide against a law enforcement officer would be a threat to not just that officer, but the community. No, lastly, in the context of this, we're talking about split-second decisions. Once you're in fear for your life, you don't say, how long do you think this thought process was? Oh, I'm about to be ran over. Let me do some quick calculations. If I discharge my firearm at this woman trying to run me over and murder me, is there a chance that it'll cause her to swerve, to leave off the gas, etc.? Or would her dead body slump forward and just keep coming over me? Let me do some calculations to try to figure that out. That's not the way the law works, my friend. Once he had reasonable fear for his life, secondhand Monday morning quarterbacking saying, no, wait a minute, I think even if the bullet struck her, there's zero chance because he was so close to the vehicle that this would have caused her to swerve to miss him, therefore he wasn't justified in the shooting, is absurd.
Rob, you can make the argument that him taking the actions that he did that day made it worse for bystanders. It made it worse for the public.
That's irrelevant to the calculation. That's irrelevant to the calculation. You could make that argument you could make that argument, and yet it's irrelevant because what matters is the thought process of the law enforcement officer at the time and legally what he's allowed to do. And you could say the same case about any time that law enforcement lethally discharges a weapon against someone. For example, you could say even that maniac shooting an AK-47, if law enforcement shoots and neutralizes him, there's a chance that it could wound him, causing the man to become even angrier and then shoot more innocent bystanders. The mere fact of shooting at the guy could cause him to grab a hostage, which would cause, yet that wouldn't factor into the legality or the morality of whether or not the law enforcement officer is allowed to exchange fire back. You say, well, he could have hit her and then caused her car. Again, these are things we're talking about. He had about 0.3 seconds to decide, and the law is quite clear. Would you say then, let me ask you this, since that's the question I want to ask, in all cases where a perpetrator is trying to use a vehicle to run over a law enforcement officer, they should never be allowed to shoot because there is a chance if they shoot and hit the person, it could cause the person to become more dangerous and hit members of the community. Would you say that?
No, I think there's some situations where that's warranted, but this was not that situation.
Why is that?
Okay.
What? Show me a situation that be warranted, but this one's not.
No, I think those would be the exception. I think as a general rule of thumb, no, I don't think you should shoot at a driver
So
who
if a
is
driver is it just
who's
to be
driving.
clear,
I think
a
the situation you're talking about is an
driver
exception.
is barreling into a police barricade, and you don't think the police should be allowed to shoot?
That's one of the situations where it would be
Okay,
best.
it's
But
not
if
a
he's just on
barricade.
the
A
highway, if
driver's
somebody's just driving
barreling.
on the
Okay,
highway,
a
of
driver's
course not.
barreling to two police officers. Are they allowed to shoot?
No, I'm saying I'm making the difference here for you. I'm describing the difference. If somebody's just driving in between neighborhoods, or if they're on the highway, no, you shouldn't shoot that person. But if they're
trying
driving
to run you
at
over,
a police officer, like when they're
like Renee Good was. Right.
yards ahead, and there's multiple of them, and they're obviously intending on running them over. Yeah, I think that's the exception where you are.
So your big brain
supposed to
take here
shoot the
is
driver.
your big brain take is well. Sometimes you wouldn't like if someone's just driving through a neighborhood, the cops shouldn't just shoot and kill them. Yeah, no shit. That's not the
Right.
issue. The issue is she's
Exactly. And
driving
I'm
as
saying,
the officer has a fear that he's about to be ran over.
yeah, no, I think whenever, even in this situation, even if the officer is like yards away, no, I think the first thing that officer should do is get out of the fucking way.
I don't think he had much time to get out of the way. And I'm not interested in your Monday morning quarterback.
Okay.